Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. For years, there have been some people in right-wing circles, and especially those close to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who have pushed for Israel to prioritize the support of evangelical Christians over that of American Jews, some of whom are believed to be disproportionately among Israel's critics. It is an interesting notion and carries with it no small dose of controversy. While Israelis tend to look at evangelicals as simply Americans who support the Jewish state, the theological foundation for that support, as well as the political context, has put off Jews who come from more liberal and progressive circles. But even if we put that aside, there's the question of how reliable the evangelical support is for Israel. In a new study that Dr. Shlomo Fischer and Dr. Dov Maimon, two of my JPPI colleagues, have published, they look at the decline in evangelical support, especially among young evangelicals. They look at why it's happening and what can be done to stop the decline. And then what does it all mean for Israel on the eve of this upcoming tenuous US presidential election? I caught up with Shlomo this week at the JPPI offices for a fascinating discussion on one of the more interesting elements of the US-Israel relationship. Here we go. So Shlomo, it's great to have you back on the podcast, and we're here to talk about your new book, American Evangelicals, Jews, and Israel. You wrote it together with Dr. Dov Maimon, both of you senior fellows here at JPPI. Interesting timing for a book like this, obviously just a few weeks out, coming ahead of the US election that's around the corner, getting tight as it nears. But this is looking at it from a different perspective than just the US election, right? It's looking at how they play into Israel, how Israel is our relationship as a country with the evangelical community. So maybe just first, what was the study really launched to achieve, and why now?
Well, the study we started the study because we thought that the new data was coming in, that the traditional attitude that the evangelical support for Israel was steadfast because it's religiously and theologically based. We thought, and it's confirmed by the data, that that's erroneous, and that it cannot be taken for granted, and that it has to be cultivated, and it has to be, you have to understand what it's really about. And
by the way, that seems like just an Israeli problem in general. Like, we tend to take a lot for granted, right? We take Jewish support in America for granted. We take American support for Israel for granted. We take the evangelical support for Israel for granted.
That's correct. And one hopes that this is the day after Yom Kippur, that people and that the elites running the country and in the military and in the political system have done what's called in Hebrew a cheshbon nefesh, have done
some thinking of accountability.
Yes. Right? So we want to include this topic as well, not only.
So basically, I mean, what you're talking about, and you open up with the story of Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer. He comes back to Israel after serving, 6-7 years as Israel's ambassador to Washington, if not more than that, returns to Israel, speaks for the first time at a Makori Show newspaper conference. What does he say there?
He says that the real mainstay of American support for Israel is the evangelical community, who are passionate and steadfast in their support, as opposed to the American Jewish community, which is highly critical of the Israeli policy, of the Israeli government policy.
And we know also just from voting patterns, right, that 2/3 of American Jews, more or less, do vote for the Democratic candidates as opposed to the Republican candidate. And if that is a measure of support for Israel, which I see how for the Likud party that would be a measure of support for Israel, then you could say that is those are people who are not necessarily supporting the Likud party, right? Our policies, and therefore the evangelicals who vote mostly for the Republican candidate, then they do support Israel.
Right. They not only do they vote for the Republican candidate, but they also support, many of them support the settlement effort, and they support the current policies of the government of Israel. And one has the feeling that Ambassador Dermer tends to conflate support for government policies with support for Israel.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a whole separate conversation, which we could have of, there are plenty of Democrats who are just critical of settlements, but say we support the state of Israel. Take Joe Biden as an example.
Absolutely.
Right. I don't think we could say that Joe Biden is not a supporter of Israel after everything he's done over the last year for Israel.
I fully agree with that.
Right. But I mean, put that aside for this conversation. So what you're basically saying, and then you start as that the starting point, and you say, okay, we're going to look at what is the actual support among evangelicals for Israel. So what is it?
Okay, so it's true that in the white older evangelical community, support for Israel is very strong. That's the traditional base of strong evangelical support. The problem is that this base is shrinking rapidly, I would even say.
From a demographic perspective?
From a demographic perspective, absolutely. And two trends are influencing it. A larger and larger percentage of evangelicals are not white, but rather Black and Latino.
Okay.
And B, the younger generation of white evangelicals are not nearly as supportive of Israel.
Is it because they're not nearly as religious as their parents?
That may be part of it, because we know that there's sort of less church attendance, etc. Things like that. We don't know whether that's because of their age. In other words, once they get married, etc., they'll start going to church more often, etc. But in general, they resemble much more their peers in age groups, across the United States.
So we're talking about under the age of 30?
Under the age of 30, especially under the age of 50, and especially under the age of 30.
So tell me, under the age of 30 for a moment, what's the support like among young evangelicals?
Well, the latest data is really alarming. I mean, it's like 10%. I mean,
10% of them support Israel.
Yeah, I mean, in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, where do you place your support? That was the question, right? 42% say they support neither. 10.3% have very strong support for Israel, and another 11%. So 22%
support Israel.
Support Israel. And that, when we're talking about an older generation, you're talking about 89.
And how much support the Palestinians? So if you see
also very low, and that's why you get this thing that 42%.
Right, but the number of support of the Palestinians lean towards Palestinians, support Palestinians, and very strong support of Palestinians. We're looking at a similar number.
Correct.
To the support of Israel.
Correct.
Right. So basically, if we're at a standoff, then the trajectory is not to our favor.
Correct.
Essentially.
Right.
And that's your point. Now, what is do you have an understanding of why this has happened?
Well, I think that younger evangelicals, and this is crucial, younger evangelicals respond to the same types of stimulants and same types of information and stuff that their peers do.
Right.
We know that all over the United States,
the younger generation X or Z or whatever they are.
Right.
Today.
Right. And they're much more similar to them than they are to their parents. And now one can safely say that young white evangelicals, especially after October 7th, are more pro-Israel than non-evangelicals, but it's nothing like the support that they had. That's an important point.
No, it's an important, and that I want to zoom out for. That's why I want to zoom out for a moment. Explain to us, jump up to 30,000 feet for a moment. Why do evangelicals overly support Israel?
Okay, so we devoted a large portion of our writing to this, and that the popular belief is that they have this esoteric theology called premillennial dispensationalism.
Okay,
premillennial dispensationalism.
Okay,
which was invented by
not about millennials, young people.
No, it's the same root. I mean, 1,000 years. It's 1,000 years. But the millennials, not to the year 2000, but to Jesus's rule of 1,000 years over the world. Refers to. That's the end. Okay, that's a whole theological.
But what does it mean?
And that means that they believe, because of what it says in the book of Revelations, that the Jewish return to the land of Israel is necessary for the second coming of Jesus Christ, and for the redemption of the world. I mean, as it were, salvation of the
now
world.
this belief does raise concern among some people, among Jews.
One second. Yeah.
Okay.
So this belief among many groups it comes attached with a rider. I mean, it's not that, we support Israel but so you have to understand, according to this way of looking at things, which we'll correct in a second, according to this way of looking at things, so they support Israel because Israel is necessary for their, I'm going to use a big word, eschatological vision, for their vision of the end days of time, how the world is going to end. And it's necessary that the Jews come back to the state of Israel, to the Holy Land, establish their rule again. And then Jesus will come back. And according to many of them, well, 2/3 will either they accept Jesus or they will perish.
And the other third?
The other third will accept Jesus. 2/3 will perish, and the other third will accept Jesus.
Okay. So I
So
put aside the end game for a moment.
Yeah.
If I put that aside, what that does give the state of Israel, though, is a strong support for the fact that we are here as a state.
right, only the
And for the settlements also.
correct. The only problem with that is that it's not entirely true. I mean, in other words, this is a little bit of a myth.
Mhm.
In other words, that
It's a myth that what?
that they believe they support Israel because of this theology.
Okay.
Now, it turns out that only about 10% of evangelicals really believe this theology, even though it makes great movies and great video games.
So they
Mhm.
basically the foundation of their support is not the theology.
Correct.
So what is it then?
Okay, so this is fascinating, but it's a different, American Jews have to get used to this because it's a very different take on American-Israel relations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Americans, and this is true since like the 1800s, like since the revolution, tend to view Israel now has multi meanings. Israel as in the Bible, Israel as the current state, Israel as the Jewish people, as somehow a mirror image of themselves. In other words, there's a strong current in American civilization which views America as a chosen people and views that America has a divine or sacred task in the world. And when they look around and say, well, who do we model? How do we know what to do? Oh, the Bible tells us what to do.
I mean, what you're saying is interesting. I actually had to pass the time in shul in synagogue over Yom
Okay.
Kippur, and I read a very interesting article by Brett Stevens in one of the latest editions of the Sapir magazine
Okay.
that the Maimonides Foundation
Okay.
puts out, which is about American support for Israel. And in there, he does go back in time to the founding fathers.
Correct.
And to quotes from, I'm forgetting who at Madison and others, maybe
Even before that.
who
yeah.
talk about the Hebrews and the
Yeah,
ancient Hebrews and
absolutely.
what they did in following in their footsteps.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Our American Israel. That's a phrase from Reverend Abbott in 1792.
Mm-hmm.
Our American Israel. In other words, that this parallelism they see.
So you're saying this is the foundation of the evangelical
Correct.
support more than the theology.
Correct.
Right. So it's not theologically driven. It's more like
Culturally,
cultural, political, ideological.
Correct.
In that sense.
correct.
And therefore maybe this explains the deterioration or the erosion of that support, is that if it was religious based, it might preserve itself.
Correct.
As religion preserves itself over time. But when it's not religion based,
Correct.
then it can erode.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So explain to me for a moment what needs to, like, if this is so important for Israel, which I guess it is, right? Evangelicals make up what percentage of Americans today?
Oh, something between 20 and 30%.
20 and 30%. Do we have the breakdown of how many of them are Caucasian?
Yes, we do.
And
Yes, we do.
how
Yes,
does
we
that
do.
break up?
At this point, approximately 30% of the evangelical community is of people of color.
People of color. Obviously, Israel is not overly popular among people of color.
Well, one second. So let's be a little bit more okay. Among the Latino community, it seems to be that the support for Israel is as strong as among the white community. So that's but where the issue lies, and this is because the issue lies with the Black evangelical community, where the Blacks are divided. I mean, the Blacks are divided within themselves. In Black culture, there's a division of this sort, that on the one hand, Black culture, and talking about religion and spirituals and stuff like that identified very strongly with the Israel narrative as being of emancipation from slavery.
Mhm.
Paul Robeson, Let My People Go. I mean, you're talking about classic American spirituals and music and the whole way that the blacks think about themselves and the African Americans think about themselves and their history.
Mhm.
So on the one hand, you have a strong base over there. On the other hand, as the book now by Coates, by, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Tahisi, yeah, the who recently came out, very controversial, was on a podcast.
Right.
Award-winning writer, very popular in the United States, was on a podcast last week where he basically insinuated,
Well, his new book is
right,
The Messenger.
yeah.
Right, The Messenger. Right.
Doing interviews for his book, he did talk about what happened on October 7th and how he could not rule out the possibility that he himself would take up arms
Well,
against the state of Israel.
But the basis of that is the identification. The Palestinians are oppressed. We have
Yeah.
been oppressed.
Right.
We need solidarity of intersectionality. All oppressed peoples owe each other solidarity, and that's also a motif within the black,
within the African American
community.
But what this basically does mean, though, based on the evidence, the data, the fact that there's an erosion, it's not religious based, means that, okay, we have an issue as a state or as a country. What should we be doing to rectify the situation?
Okay, so
or improve it?
Okay, so what the government has been done, and this is reflected in Ron Dermer's remarks, really, is that the government has sort of assumed that the evangelicals are all conservative Republicans, and that the future of is that we should bet on the conservative Republicans in Congress and in and the Republican Party and Donald Trump and all that stuff, and that's who we cater to. And I think that we have to take a much more broader view of this. We should develop ties. Like I said, the African American community is on the one hand has reason or a basis to be anti-Israel because of its identification with the Palestinians, but it also has a lot of reasons to be pro-Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And we should cultivate how shall I say, a liberal democratic narrative of being pro-Israel and reach out to these people. We have trouble we know that we have trouble within the liberal wing or the progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
By the way, also particularly in the Black Caucus in
Correct.
Congress, right?
Which
Many members of still fall back even years later. We're almost 10 years later to the 2015 speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu against the Black president of the United States, Barack Obama at the time.
Correct.
Right.
And we should learn to use the Black evangelicals who are ambivalent or have an attitude which is more pro-Israel than non-evangelicals as a bridge, as a way in to rebuild ties with the Democrats, with the liberal community, with the progressive community, and show that yes, you can be progressive, you can be liberal, and still support Israel. In other words, you need a
I know. I totally hear what you're saying. It's interesting though, because over the years I've heard, I'm guessing you've heard this also, especially from the more liberal American Jews, and definitely liberal American Jewish leaders, whether it's Reform, conservative, rabbinic leaders or organizational leaders, that the embrace by Israel over the last definitely 15 years, let's say, of the Netanyahu era of the evangelicals has been a put off to a lot of liberal Americans.
Absolutely.
Who have said, you're getting into bed with very radical. They look at it, I think, on two levels, right? They look at it there's the theological issue, which disturbs them, that you mentioned before, whether it's at the foundation or not, that you explained is very interesting. So there's the theological level, but I think what's more is the political. These are people who favor abortion, right?
So 1 second. So let me address that for a second, because that's a very important part of the study.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, evangelicals, American evangelicals, Jews, and Israel. So
Right.
we discuss. So there are two issues that have to be overcome over here. The first issue is relates much more to the character of America. Evangelicals believe that America is a Christian country. And American Jews, who until now have done extremely well in their integration into American life, are really afraid of that. They're afraid of the notion that America becomes defined as a Christian country, and that will be used as a way of excluding them from access to, types of positions and influence that they've
And American
that
Jews
they've
have been
had.
very successful.
Right.
Right.
And they're afraid of that. And therefore, the people most advocating for separation of church and state has always been Jewish organizations, ADL, UJR, URJ,
Union of Reform Judaism.
Judaism,
Right.
etc. These are the people who are really standing guard of the wall that President Washington talked about between religion and state, and they're very concerned about that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is the thing that is that when many, including Donald Trump is not an evangelical, but many people in that sort of wing of American life, this sort of we use the term Jacksonian, but populist evangelical wing of American life, when they talk about Jews, they use, even though they disavow, and they're very clear about disavowing anti-Semitism, they disavow it explicitly. Nevertheless, there's always an undercurrent of the types of images and tropes that they use when talking about Jews that have an anti-Semitic ring to them. I'll give you one example. The person most hated by conservative Republicans, it's probably George Soros. Now, when you listen to the rhetoric about George Soros, it echoes the rhetoric about Mayer Amschel Rothschild in the 19th century, which was clearly anti-Semitic, right? So they talk about his tentacles. So the image of this octopus that comes and throttles and everything that lives, right? All these other images, about of bankers and of Jews controlling commerce
And media,
et cetera, et cetera. So even though they're very careful, so they never refer to Soros as a Jew. It's interesting.
Right.
But the way they talk about him is the way that anti-Semites, so it makes people nervous. It makes me nervous. When I read this stuff, it makes me nervous.
and that makes a lot of people nervous also about Donald Trump, because
Correct.
he does associate.
He does
with
the
a lot of
same
people.
thing.
He does-
Jews are into money. Jews care about.
Right. He's made comments in the past how he only trusts Jews with his money and things
Right,
like that.
right,
Now he'll
right.
say, because I love Jews, right? But
Right.
but yes, it's a bit desettling or
Right,
unsettling. Yeah.
Right.
The
So that's another issue that we want to use, some younger evangelicals who are more liberal, who are more like their peers, again, as a wedge. I think it would be a good idea to establish ties, and not just suspicion, and that between the liberal American Jewish community and the evangelical community.
So Shlomo, we're talking just after Yom Kippur. The U.S. elections is just about 3 weeks away. Very tight race between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. It will be decided, it seems, based on a couple of percentage points, even if that much, in states like Pennsylvania or Michigan or other places, Georgia, whatever it might be, Wisconsin, across the United States. How important is the evangelical vote in all of this as well?
No, the evangelical. So again, the evangelical white, the traditional.
They're in
white,
Trump's pocket.
They're in Trump's pocket. The people that are more interesting or more in play are these two communities: are the younger evangelicals and the black and the Afro-American.
Yeah, and I read just a study the other day, which I didn't break down to evangelicals, but that African-American men,
correct,
20%
are going over to
Trump, and Harris is caring for now. Polls show, there was one in the New York Times just the other day, just about 70-something% of African-American,
way down from what it used to be.
Way down 90% in Clinton's time. So
correct.
in Hillary's race
Right.
back in 2016.
Correct.
So that's a big blow, and that's why we saw, by the way, Barack Obama come out and start campaigning.
Right.
But,
so here's the thing: how, to put it very succinctly, how will black evangelicals vote? Will they vote as blacks, or will they vote as evangelicals?
Interesting.
That will be that's the way we sort of frame the frame the issue. And that could be because of the nature of a place like Georgia, where you have a large Black community, large African American community, and a large evangelical African American community. That could be significant.
That could be that could
make a
determine
break.
the election.
That can make a break.
Wow, very interesting. And this obviously has strong impact on Israel.
Absolutely,
because we got a lot at stake
absolutely.
in this election as well.
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me to some extent. I mean, very interesting timing for this book to come out. But in our annual assessment of JPPI, which just recently came out, one of our recommendations, which should be obvious but not always is stay out of the election, Israel. Don't be perceived
Correct.
as interfering in
Correct.
the election.
Correct.
And we're talking, by the time this comes out, it could be that Israel will already have struck Iran, and how this plays out and what happens. But there's a lot of different factors here in everything that Israel does.
I mean, the assumption behind our study, one of the assumptions behind the study, which is not, explicit, but it's a JPPI assumption, which is that Israel is best served by a bipartisan support for Israel, and one ought to cultivate bipartisan support for Israel, and that liberal American support is as important as conservative support.
I liked what you said, that because it's kind of an oxymoron almost, that by making inroads into, let's say, the African American evangelical community or the Latino evangelical community, you're also making inroads into a liberal American community.
Correct.
And that is something that anyhow Israel has to do.
We need to do that.
Right.
Because,
so here you kind of get two at maybe the price of one to some extent. But we do definitely need to do a better job when it comes to the Democrats and the liberals. Thank you very much, Shlomo.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you very much for joining us on the latest JPPI podcast webinar. We are usually here Mondays and Thursdays. We'll be taking off for the Sukkot holiday, so you will miss us on Thursday, but we will be back the following week. In the meantime, have a Chag Sameach, a happy holiday. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and of course, the website of Times of Israel. Thank you.